One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Fermentation is the seemingly magical, though entirely scientifically explainable process that turns the wort brewers make into delicious beer. Now, the microorganism responsible for this wonderful conversion is yeast, a single-celled fungi that, like all living organisms, works better when provided an optimal environment. Now, brewers have adopted various strategies to ensure their yeast are well taken care of, for example, by using starters and precisely controlling fermentation temperature. But there's another thing that can be done to further reduce the risk of a problematic fermentation. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and with me today to talk about yeast nutrients is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, we're going to talk about yeast nutrients today. I don't know about you, Marshall, but yeast is absolutely my favorite single-cell organism.
100%, man. Yeah.
So we're going to talk about nutrients, adding yeast nutrient to when, how to use it, what yeast nutrients are available, why to use it, all of that good stuff. It's going to get a little sciencey today, but I think that that's something that will be interesting to our listeners, and it's certainly something that's interesting to me. So
yeah. Totally agree. And not that it's a terribly controversial topic. It really isn't. But there does seem to be some pretty strong opinions about the necessity of using yeast nutrient. It wasn't until maybe a year ago that I actually picked up some nutrient for myself, but it wasn't even for beer. It was for cider. I'd mentioned to Jake, our contributor, that after pitching dry yeast into apple juice, there was like a 3-ish day lag before I noticed fermentation activity taking off. He recommended I add some nutrient to speed things up, and that actually did seem to help, which got me wondering if it might have an impact on beer as well. And I know a lot of people who, as a matter of course, use nutrients. So I tested it out in an experiment. We're going to be talking about the purported impact of yeast nutrient as well as those results in just a bit. All right, if you enjoy what it is we're doing here at Brewlosophy, consider becoming one of our patrons, where in exchange for your support, you get a cool reward. Things like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. Our lineup this year is pretty nuts. We've got some killer folks coming to answer questions from your patron questions, like February's guest, Mitch Steele, who recently left Stone Brewing to start his own thing in Atlanta, Georgia, called New Realm Brewing. Mitch also wrote the book IPA, Brewing Techniques, Recipes, and the Evolution of India Pale Ale. He is a really great guy. Make sure to become a patron before February 20th so you don't miss this one. All past sessions with people like Vinny Cilurzo, John Palmer, and Gordon Strong are available on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you want. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate that as well. All right, feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Nigel Brewer wrote in with some thoughts after listening to episode 93 on reducing cold side oxidation. He said, you guys were discussing using the CO2 produced by fermentation to purge kegs filled with star sand. I think this is a great idea, but it makes me wonder what kind of back pressure would be placed on the fermenting beer. Would this pressure be comparable to fermenting under pressure using a spunding valve, for example, around 1 bar or 15 psi? Would this back pressure affect different yeast species and strains differently? Just a thought and maybe a good avenue for an experiment. It's a good question, Nigel. What do you think, kid?
Yeah, that is a good question, Nigel. I don't know that I have a clear answer on that. It's definitely going to create some back pressure, but I really don't know if it's more than, an airlock or something else. It seems to me that you're pushing out a larger volume of liquid, and so maybe that is going to require a little bit more pressure. I do know that for sure certain yeast strains are purportedly, I said I do know for sure purportedly. There's an awesome lawyer answer for you. But I do know that there's science that has said that certain yeast strains do respond differently to pressure. I mean, I think we've talked about, like, this is Saison DuPont strain. There's some dispute whether or not that actually responds to pressure. Some people do. Some people think it doesn't. But yeah, I mean, it could potentially vary based on the yeast strain. It would be interesting if somebody had sort of I'm not sure if there's a meter or something that you could get to just sort of figure out what the pressure is pushing on or off the keg, but that'd be kind of interesting. I will say that I've never used that method myself. I've heard of people using it, and the people that use it don't seem to have any issues with, the yeast performing and getting fully attenuated and finishing their beers. So even if there is some sort of pressure effect or additional increased pressure on the yeast, I'm not sure that it's going to have an actual outcome, an actual noticeable effect on the finished beer.
So I'm one of these people who uses this method all the time. Only at this point, I've only tried it with Spike Brewing Flex Plus fermentation vessel because it is rigged up to be able to do this very easily. I get this question a few times a week at this point about the back pressure that's created when purging that primary keg, is what I call it. So pushing the star sand out of there. I paid really close attention to the pressure buildup when fermenting my last batch, and it really did seem to stay very low. To my eyes, it seemed like the star sand started flowing out of the first keg into the second one, like maybe 2 psi, 3 psi. The gauge that comes with the Flex Plus is one of the high psi gauges, so it's not terribly fine. But it honestly 2-3 psi, and you start seeing that the star sand flow out of that first keg. That really doesn't seem like that much to me. Certainly not what I've read can have an impact on fermentation, on yeast or anything like that. Now, I'm not saying that using this method doesn't have some sort of a sensory, perceptible impact on the finished beer. In fact, I'm starting to wonder if it doesn't in some way encourage more, I guess, like sulfur. I get a little bit of a sulfury thing when I'm using this method in the beers that I'm making. I don't know if that's because of something else that I'm doing, and it's easy to get rid of that sulfur. But besides that, the yeast doesn't seem to underperform by any means. So there's that. I don't 15 psi. If I don't even think Spike is recommending you ferment under pressure in their fermentation vessels, but they're definitely the Flex Plus is rated to hold a max of 15 psi. I've never gotten it up that high. So it's definitely not even close to that. So there's the answer for that. I do appreciate the question, Nigel. And if you are doing this method, please be sure that you're properly venting everything. I heard from somebody last week who did the same thing that I'm doing using some other fermentation vessel, and they forgot to put a gas disconnect on the second keg. So everything was flowing until it stopped, until the pressure built up enough, and they were wondering why there was no flowing. Yeah, that can create a bomb there. So you just want to be careful with that kind of thing. So, all right, if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Cade, have you ever heard or even had Keptingus?
Never. I had never heard of this.
I hadn't either until I read a post on larsblog.com in June of 2018. I love that blog, by the way, about how to make this very traditional Lithuanian farmhouse beer. The process is rather peculiar, and listener Justin Murray from Tacoma, Washington gave it a shot. Here's how he told me he did it. I'm just going to read the note that he left me. He says that he mashed 8 gallons of 8 gallons of water with 16 pounds of two-row that steeped for an hour. He then moved the entire mash into lasagna pans and put them into a barbecue at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 hours. That caramelized and burnt the mash and evaporated a lot of the liquid. While barbecuing my mash, I took the head off of an 8-gallon used barrel, stopped the bung, and tapped a valve into the other head. I stuffed the barrel with straw. And then after 4 hours of barbecuing, I loudered the baked mash through the straw and collected 2.5 gallons of 1090 OG wort. I sparsed with an extra 2 gallons of boiled water over the straw to collect a total of 4.5 gallons at 1064 OG. In a separate pot, I boiled 1 ounce of Simcoe in 12 ounces of water for 30 minutes and tossed that into the wort. When the wort got down to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, I pitched a pouch of Loki. That's Imperial Yeast's Kvike yeast. The beer's all all right. He says, nothing I'd order, but damn the romanticism of farmhouse sales. That makes it taste better. If you want to give Jersey and Tim an extra special treat, let it warm up for a little bit. That's exactly what I did before I served it to my buddies.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Look at that. It looks like caramels.
It does.
1, 2, 3, go. Oh.
Is it that bad?
Oh. It's like when someone kicks you in the nuts and you're waiting to see if it hurts. You know that feeling.
It doesn't sneak up on you like that, though.
Most don't sneak up on you.
Till like a minute
Dude,
later.
I don't like this at all.
Yeah.
Kind of skunky, mushroomy, skunky.
Yeah, it's kind of bland.
Now, just detach yourself from your learned madness for a second and be like, if I was at a brewery and I ordered this and I drank it, would I finish it, or would I just be like, this one's a sunk
think something's
cost?
wrong with your lines.
Yeah.
You need to clean the lines.
Now, if this was on tap, I'd be like, it's time to clean the lines again, Marshall, because I don't know how to do it. You know,
It smells like dirty feet.
it's a little bit funky to me, funky and skunky.
I'm not going to finish.
As a normal humane, I don't like it, dude.
I do not.
But I appreciate that a lot of effort went into making it, and probably like a lot of thought into the ingredients. And no, this sucks. I hate it.
It's not good.
Not only is it not good, but I want to find the person who's like, well, there's the esters and phenols are perfectly balanced.
I don't like it.
We both did not finish them. I appreciate your efforts, and I'm a learned man, but I don't like it.
Negative
0.
1.
All right, I'm with the guys in that I would never order this beer if it was on tap somewhere. But I also didn't think it was as bad as they did. Certainly funky and weird, but not gross. It's probably the fact that I knew how the beer was made and what, the traditional take on it that influenced my perspective. Either way, I appreciate the fact that Justin took the time to brew this Keptingus and sent us a bottle. And the reason I'm saying it like that is because my wife's family is all very Latvian. In fact, she just did 23andMe and came back like 98.9% from Riga, Latvia. And so Lithuanian and Latvian languages are very similar. So they taught me how to say this. So very cool stuff. Something you would ever try, Cade? I'm kind of guessing you're not going to go through the trouble of making Keptingus.
So I looked this up on Lars' blog, and Lars does an amazing job of romanticizing the way that this thing is brewed. It sounds really good the way that he does it, but the way that Jersey and Tim tasted it, I don't know that I'll be doing this anytime soon. But I just think that's fascinating. Actually, baking the mash and then running grain over the baked mash, no boil, none of that stuff. So, I mean, really, really interesting. Yesterday or today being the first time that I've actually ever heard of this beverage and looked it up in any way. Maybe we can get somebody on the crew to do a Keptingus for a BIY or something like that. But
yeah.
Probably not me.
I with you, I went back and reread the Lars blog article on this. I encourage everyone to go check it out. It's really interesting. One of the things Justin says that he kept the barbecue or the mash in the barbecue at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 hours. In rereading that article that Lars wrote, I believe they actually bake this stuff at like 400 degrees Celsius, which is, good Lord, that's hot. That's really hot. But the caramelized flavors, the way that Lars describes it, I'm not sure that's exactly what I got from Justin's Keptingus, but it was interesting, very fun to try, and I appreciate the fact that Justin sent it in. If you'd like to have your beer or any other weird fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we'll be right back after these messages. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. This episode is brought to you by Milwaukee-based Spike Brewing, designer and manufacturer of premium quality homebrewing equipment. Whether you're interested in upgrading to a stainless steel fermenter like the incredible Flex Plus or switching to a turnkey electric setup so you can brew inside and avoid the cold, wet winter, Spike Brewing has the solution for you. Visit spikebrewing.com/brewlosophy today and let their team help you figure out what you need to make the most of your brew day. Again, that's spikebrewing.com/brewlosophy. Spike Brewing. Pursue what's possible. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. When I hear the term nutrient, I think of something that nourishes a living organism, helping it to be healthier and to perform better. Yeast, which after humans is my favorite living organism, is said to benefit from nutrients in various ways, which on the surface makes sense. Let's start by talking about what exactly the purpose of using yeast nutrient is when making beer.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeast need certain things in order to do the job that we're asking them to do, which is produce ethanol and CO2 and make beer. From a basic level, yeast need sugar, nitrogen, oxygen, zinc, a bunch of phosphorus. They need a bunch of things to actually do their job. I mean, think of it just like us. We eat, food and drink in order to live because that's what our bodies need in order to survive and produce energy. Yeast are very much the same way. So they have a very specific set of things that they need to do in order to do what we want them to do in making beer. So obviously there are some things that are very, very abundant in wort, like sugar. Okay. I mean, it's mostly sugar water at the point that we're done with the mash and the boil. There's other things in there, but for the vast majority of it is sugar that the yeast can use to produce and that the yeast can use in order to make alcohol. But there are other things that may or may not be deficient in wort. So things like, zinc or oxygen, those things may not be readily consumable in wort. So the purpose of a yeast nutrient is to add those minerals, those vitamins, those nutrients into the wort so that the yeast has everything that they need to be as happy as possible and make the best, most clean beer. So from a high-level perspective, yeast nutrient is usually, or at least how I refer to yeast nutrient, is usually just a blend of those things, nitrogen, vitamins, phosphor, even dead yeast cells, that can be easily added to the wort so that it gives the yeast everything that they need to do to make beer. So that's sort of what we're talking about today in terms of from a high-level concept. Now, I'll go into a little bit about what each of those sort of things, each of the components of nutrient does for beer and why it may or may not be important. But from a high level, that's kind of what we're talking about. So, jumping right off into the deep end, like I said earlier, there's a bunch of things that yeast needs, sugar being the most important for us, for our purposes, but they also need nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace metals. Those are also oxygen, zinc, and things like that. But some of those things are present already in all malt wort. So nitrogen is usually present in wort. If you think about it, all plant-based organisms have nitrogen. And so when we're using wort, we're using barley, even malted barley has nitrogen in it. And the form that yeast use is usually amino acids. And amino acids, yeast can either make its own set of amino acids or they can sort of take them up from the wort. So there's a concept which you'll hear professional brewers talk about, which is FAN, which is free amino nitrogen. And so that's something oftentimes that brewers are adding. Have you heard about, FAN and free amino nitrogen?
Yeah, this is certainly not my wheelhouse, talking about nutrients, I'll be honest. But FAN is probably in talking about yeast nutrients, what I've heard the most. And I remember I was having a conversation years ago at a homebrew club meeting, and somebody was talking about nitrogen being important, a yeast nutrient, and all of this. And some guy with a nitro tap setup said, why can't I just dose my wort with nitrogen the same way I do oxygen? Different things, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally different things. Like I said, so nitrogen in the form of amino acids,
Right.
Is what.
I just wanted to make sure our listeners understand you can't be going off dosing your wort with nitro.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that also sort of brings up a good point too. So nitrogen is a good thing for yeast, but like anything else, too much of a good thing is a bad thing.
It's toxic, right? Exactly.
Yeah, it can be toxic. It can stress the yeast out, and then you get a whole bunch of byproducts that you don't want, sulfur or anything else like that. Difference in nitrogen gas versus nitrogen in the form of an amino acid, which is what the yeast needs. But like some yeasts, like especially the Kveik strains that everybody's that's kind of hot right now. It's the Hansel of yeast strains right now. Yeah, that's a Zoolander joke. I hope everybody got that. Anyway. Kveik is or certain strains of it supposedly require more nitrogen. So this is something that brewers are thinking about, adding to Kveik yeast nitrogen. You also have phosphorus, which is used by the cell in making its cell membranes and its cell wall. And it's also used for DNA replication. So yeast is, I was going about its business, growing energy, reproducing, making alcohol, making CO2, and just sort of living and loving life. If it doesn't have enough phosphorus, then it can't really reproduce. And so either goes dormant or dies off and finishes out. So these are things that yeast, needs. Phosphorus is something that is important to the yeast. Another thing that's important about phosphorus, nitrogen, and some of these other nutrients is yeast is a cell, right? Which means it has an outer membrane and it's got a cell wall and an outer membrane, and things have to pass through that into the cell in order for it to be able to do what it needs to do. Meaning sugars have to come from outside the cell in through the cell wall and into the cells so that it can produce alcohol, ethanol, and then the alcohol actually has to go out of the cell. Same thing with the CO2. So that permeability of the cell wall is actually really important on a micro scale. And if you're deficient in some of these nutrients that I've talked about, the yeast can't do what it needs to do at the right level. So that's also sort of one of the reasons why we want to add nutrients or add things to it that helps the yeast do its job. I bring that up sort of in talking about phosphorus because that's an easy one to sort of describe, a way that these nutrients can add and help the wort along. But there are other things that we often talk about too. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and some other trace metals like calcium and that kind of stuff are oftentimes present in wort. Calcium especially is one that I think a lot of us are familiar with, especially those that are doing, water salt additions. Calcium chloride or magnesium sulfate or calcium sulfate, gypsum. But all malt wort especially has these things: nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, some of those things. But there are other things that are missing from wort, like, for example, oxygen. Barley doesn't have a huge supply of oxygen that's easily accessible for yeast. Same thing with zinc. If you've read Jamil Zainasheff and Chris White's yeast book, they talk about it pretty much the entire book, the importance of oxygen and zinc for yeast. It's throughout the whole thing, they really say that you can't underestimate the importance of these things. So those things are missing from wort, or at least not usually in sufficient amounts,
Right.
or supposedly not insufficient amounts.
That's what that was my understanding. Zinc is another one that I have heard quite a bit about. And you'll hear people who don't want to use nitrogen. I'm sorry, who don't want to use nutrients just for whatever reason. I guess I consider myself in that camp. It's just another thing to do. Who will still argue, that all malt wort has everything that it needs for healthy yeast. So if you're building up starters and everything else is in order, you shouldn't have to worry about nutrients at all. But zinc is definitely one of those. It's a mineral that is just deficient in malt, in all malt worts, and so I think that's why Jamil and Chris focus so heavily on the importance of ensuring adequate, levels of zinc in that wort. And again, thinking of this from the perspective of the professional brewer, it makes sense that the bigger your batch and the more money you stand to make off of said batch, the more you're going to be concerned about covering as many bases as you can.
Yeah, totally. A nutrient is a good form of insurance as well, right? I mean, from a professional perspective, you really don't want to have a stuck fermentation or increased esters or sulfur or any of those things. So adding in a handful of yeast nutrient really helps make sure and ensure that consistency of batch from batch to batch. A place where it's also useful for home brewers is anybody that's harvesting their yeast. Yeast is using up not all of it, but using up a lot of the stuff that's in wort through fermentation. And when it's done, it hibernates. So adding that back into the next batch is often useful. Again, some of that stuff exists in all malt wort. So if you're using all malt wort, a lot of this stuff will exist. But oxygen and zinc being the two that are generally regarded as deficient. Zinc especially, this was kind of interesting. I had no idea about this before I read that book on yeast, but I didn't know that zinc is actually a cofactor for the enzyme that allows the yeast to produce alcohol.
I actually, again, not my wheelhouse, but I actually had heard of that, so I'm not too far out there.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of we don't necessarily think about these things as often as home brewers, but it is something that could be important to your beers. Especially if you're repitching yeast, or even if you're pitching direct from direct pouches. Giving the yeast the ability to make the beer that you want it to make is a really useful tool. We've been talking quite a bit about all malt wort, but there are brewers like myself that like to make things that have adjuncts in them. I've talked a lot about how I like light lagers, and I have no fear of brewing an adjunct lager. Send me your hate mail if you want to. But I like to keep them on tap. I like to keep them around, especially in the summer. So if you're using a beer that's got adjuncts in it, like corn or, rice or any of those things, that's going to be a little bit more deficient in nitrogen. So you may consider adding some nitrogen to it to help your yeast along. If you're noticing that it's not fermenting well, or you're getting some off flavors that you don't like, this is another tool in your toolkit to be able to use.
Yeah. Yeah, and I talked about earlier how the only time when I started using yeast nutrient wasn't for my beer at all, and I've had really good experiences brewing beer without yeast nutrient. So I'm not to say that they can't be better, but it was using it with a zero malt hard cider that really changed my perspective on the stuff. I was pitching dry yeast into apple juice, and it'd lag for 2 or 3 days before I started noticing airlock activity and the little krausen developing on top of the juice. Jake tells me to use some yeast nutrient, and I do that, and same exact yeast, same exact juice. Within about 12 hours, I was noticing steady activity coming from the fermenter. That's pretty, to me, that was pretty mind blowing to see that just the addition of this nutrient, it seemed to send the message to me, this stuff is doing something.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a great example too. You're talking about cider, wine, mead. Those types of beverages are deficient generally in these nutrients that yeast need. So that's a great example. I mean, I think most people who are brewing ciders are adding some form of yeast nutrient to the cider, especially to reduce lag time or fermentation. But that's an interesting point that you brought up as well. right? You noticed in the cider that the yeast or that the fermentation took off faster with the use of nutrient. This is something that's really important to professional brewers, is cutting down, or not cutting down, but being as efficient as possible with fermentation. So if you can get a beer out the door 2 or 3 days faster over the course of a year, that's a lot of extra beer that you can make and sell to, to consumers. And from a homebrewer perspective too, if you can cut down on the time that it takes for fermentation to happen, say you cut out a day or two by adding nutrient, if fermentation takes off faster, that's something where you can turn around a beer quickly. You got a party in 2 weeks, turn it around, add some nutrient to it. Maybe you'll be able to get it done.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's sort of what we're talking about whenever we're talking about adding nutrients. But, why would we add nutrients? Okay, I understand that the yeast needs this stuff, but you've just told me, Cade, that all malt wort has a lot of this stuff except maybe oxygen and zinc. And so why would I need it? Well, like I just said, so reducing lag time is a supposed benefit of using yeast nutrient. You've readily made all of the nutrients available that the yeast can just take up and get cooking, right? Like get started reproducing, making, growing, reproducing, and then producing alcohol and CO2. So that faster fermentation time. But also reducing inconsistency. Like I said, I talked about insurance a little bit earlier. Marshall brought it up. If you're adding this nutrient to it, that the yeast has sufficient nutrient for what it needs, so it's going to produce a consistent product. If you're pitching, especially, I know that I've done this before. Buying a fresh vial of yeast versus a vial of yeast that's been sitting for a year versus using a starter or something like that. There's different nutrient availability for each of those things. And so this is nice to have. Adding nutrient increases how the cell can do its job. And, and especially too, another thing, if you are harvesting your yeast, not just when you've harvested it and reused it, but setting up the conditions so that when you harvest the yeast is still healthy and viable, right? If yeast had to go through a whole bunch of stress and produced a bunch of fusel alcohols or off flavors, esters and everything, and then you're harvesting that yeast, the yeast that you're harvesting isn't necessarily going to be healthy or viable, and you're going to have the same issues pitching it on down the road, So adding nutrient to the beginning to give the yeast a healthy and vigorous fermentation could be useful in helping your multi-generational pitches be better. All this stuff is really really fascinating and really useful for nutrient. And then we talk a little bit earlier about what happens if you don't use nutrient. There's a bunch of things that could go wrong with your fermentation. Some of these you'd notice. You talked about having a little sulfur in your beers. Marshall, maybe you're not using enough nutrient.
Believe me, it's crossed my mind. Is there something that I'm not doing? The only reason I thought that, not to go too far off the path here, but is because of the new way that I've been fermenting, completely closed. But yeah, maybe nutrients would help that kind of stuff, One of the things that when I think about yeast nutrients, and honestly, my lack of using them for making beer for the most part, I always kind of go back to thinking about my experiences brewing the experiment beers for the kettle trube stuff, right? So I've done 2 or 3 kettle trube experiments, basically comparing beers fermented with almost no kettle trube at all versus beers fermented with a ton of kettle trube racked over to the fermenter. And very consistently, the beers that have no kettle trube and also no nutrient, right, end up taking off a lot later than the ones with a bunch of kettle trube. And I was talking to some people about this after those experiments, and people were saying it's because the crap that it makes up trube, that stuff, is very nutrient rich. It's lipids, it's fans, all of this stuff is there's elements of it contained in the trube. And I don't know this for sure, but is that in a way can you rely on, I guess what I'm thinking here is like alternatives to exogenous yeast nutrients, things that you're adding. Is there a way to utilize, a little bit of that kettle trube as a form of yeast nutrient, as opposed to maybe adding something from the outside?
Oh, totally. I mean, that's my understanding as well. I mean, obviously, I've never seen a breakdown of what's in kettle trube, but it contains a lot of things that are nutritious for yeast. I remember those experiments whenever they first came out, and I remember, you. Actually, I think you and I did a podcast on kettle trube. Where I remember looking at the pictures of the carboy, which was just full, and it looked like grassy, grass clippings that you just dumped into a beer versus the other one, and then you said it fermented faster and everything. So yeah, there is a bunch of nutritious stuff in kettle trube. Like I said, all malt wort contains a bunch of nutrients that yeast needs. There's a couple that it may be deficient in, but yeah, kettle trube is a great one. So if you're looking at maybe not necessarily having to keep, a yeast nutrient on hand or add it, kettle trube is a great example of something that you can do to put in there. Now, I will always say too, there's other things that are in kettle trube and other things that could be deficient or could be not deficient, could be bad for your future beer.
There are reasons, we'll say, that brewers for a long time have been making an effort to rack only the clearest wort. Purported reasons, we should say, to rack the clearest wort to their fermentation vessels. So in no way are we making a recommendation, even though we might do certain things.
That's right. And I mean, part of that is like oxygenation. So some of those things that you're adding from the kettle into the fermenter will actually oxygenate faster if they're not taken up or used by the yeast. So, that's an example of something that is supposedly out there in kettle trube that would ultimately result in a less than ideal finished product. But yeah.
I was thinking what we could do is finish this segment by talking about some of the commercially available, yeast nutrients out there that homebrewers can go and buy themselves, or that professional brewers might be using in their brewery. I don't know how much. I certainly don't know a ton about what's available out there. I know that certain types of nutrients seem to be used more by, say, winemakers and mead makers or cider makers as opposed to brewers. But some one of the more common ones that I hear about is Cervomyces, which I believe is put out by White Labs and Lallemande. This is what I find interesting about this one is that it is said to abide by the Reinheitsgebot. So there's nothing outside of yeast, grain, water, and hops that are a part of this yeast nutrient. My assumption is, and again, I'm not an expert on this, is that Cervomyces is the yeast ghost, basically, like the dead cells of previously old yeast, basically.
Yeah, that's totally right. Yeah, I like the term using yeast ghosts, right? I like that. But that is exactly what it is. Cervomyces is yeast cells that were grown in the presence of some of these minerals that we're looking to add, like zinc or magnesium. So whenever they're grown that way, they take up that zinc and magnesium and hold it within their cells, and then they sort of die off. And then Cervomyces, I think, is a dry component. So then they're dried, and all of those nice nutrients and lipids and phosphorus and all the things that yeast really like and need are contained in that. So yeah, Cervomyces is a bunch of dead cells. Yeast can cannibalize themselves, which is kind of cool if you think about it. Well, and kind of weird, so they're eating, they're eating the yeast ghosts and taking up essentially the minerals that were inside of those cells, taking and recycling, I guess is a good way to say it.
Yeah.
Recycling those minerals and nutrients and then using it to prop themselves up and grow and do what they're needing to do. That's interesting that you said that it satisfies the Reinheitsgebot. I can kind of see that. I mean, it's just yeast, right? It's just dead yeast cells with nutrients in it. So it's not like they added any sort of chemical to the beer. It's just it's yeast.
Yeah, you're repurposing something that might otherwise be. White Labs markets it as being one of the most unique yeast nutrients, so I guess that's cool. I've never used the stuff. White Labs also has a more standard yeast nutrient that I believe is similar to what Y Yeast offers. The Y Yeast nutrient is what I've used. That's the one that I keep in my garage. I don't know. I think those are like blends, right? Of like organic and inorganic minerals and such.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so Saccharomyces and Y yeast are both blends of nutrients. So, direct from the Y yeast website is Y yeast beer nutrient is a proprietary blend of vitamins, minerals, inorganic nitrogen, organic nitrogen, zinc, phosphates, and other trace elements. So it's got everything the yeast body needs, right? It's those things. So, Saccharomyces and Y yeast are probably the two big ones for home brewers. They're readily available. Saccharomyces comes in a little caplet. If you buy it at your local homebrew shop, it's like a little, like a little pill capsule. You just drop that into the wort in the last 10 or 15 minutes of boil. And it takes the capsule, I guess, dissolves, and then the nutrients are in the wort that get transferred over into the fermenter. I also know that Saccharomyces comes in a commercial package, much bigger. It's actually just looks like dry yeast. And so that's what a lot of professional brewers are doing, is just adding Saccharomyces directly, not via a capsule, but adding it either at the boil or in the fermenter, or both. That's kind of how it works. You can add it while the yeast is going, or you can get it, get a bunch of nutrient in there at the beginning. So that's something to certainly play around with if you're using nutrient. Same thing with Y yeast. The Y yeast is the same thing, using it in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the boil.
A couple more that I think people have probably heard of, and maybe we could just do a little bit of an explanation for, is DAP, or diammonium phosphate.
Yeah, diammonium phosphate. So that's the phosphorus nutrient. That one is really is used a lot in winemaking, in must. But yeah, it's a phosphorus nutrient. It doesn't have, to my understanding, it doesn't have zinc or magnesium or some of the other trace minerals and vitamins that you might need in beer, but it's definitely a phosphorus based nutrient. So that also sort of brings up something I wanted to touch on a little bit, is the Saccharomyces and Y yeast are blends. Diammonium phosphate probably also qualifies as a blend, just not as robust. But you don't necessarily have to add the blend. If you're noticing something in your fermentation, like for example, that it's not fully attenuating, that it's getting stuck a lot, you might have a zinc deficiency. Again, I said earlier, zinc is a cofactor for alcohol dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that produces, or that allows the yeast to produce alcohol. So adding zinc itself to your fermentation could increase your attenuation. So you don't necessarily have to use the blends. You can use some of these things individually. Diammonium phosphate is a really good way to add phosphorus.
Yeah. Which contributes to the nitrogen of the wort, right? I mean, that's what the whole point of adding phosphorus, my understanding at least, is, right?
I'm not sure about the science of it, but DAP it's phosphorus, it's phosphate, but the way that the phosphate interacts, it actually adds nitrogen. It pulls nitrogen from other places.
And then the other ones that I think people have probably heard about because they've got funny names, are like Fermade K or Fermade O. Again, I think these are the idea here is that it's kind of forms of phosphate as well. Fermade O I know is like a organic nitrogen. And then another one that perhaps, and a lot of these again are used more in winemaking, but have been carried over into brewing as well, is GoFirm. Is that something that you have any experience with?
I've never used GoFirm. I've seen it a bunch of times. I actually have a pack of it at my house, but I've never actually used it. I don't make very many starters anymore, or I don't really pitch it along with fermentation. Maybe it's something I should try to use pretty soon though.
Yeah. I'm just kind of reading off of what I copy and pasted here into my notes, that it's GoFirm's a natural yeast nutrient that's added to the yeast hydration water before you add your yeast to it. And it says that it provides yeast with proper sterols, unsaturated fatty acids, and micronutrients needed to begin fermentation in optimal shape. I mean, it sounds good. I've never used it. I have used the Y yeast nutrient specifically for ciders, and I've noticed something. It seemed to have an observable impact on fermentations, in my opinion. I was curious if the same would be true for beer, so I put it to the test. Results when we return.
The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the brew bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the brew bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a brew bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. New brewers often start out using malt extracts, which I was always told include all of the necessary yeast nutrients because the manufacturer used it when making the extract. So for me, when I switched to all grain, one of the last things on my mind was yeast nutrient. My focus was on so many other things like, making yeast starters and fermentation temperature. So I never really got into the habit of using nutrients. Was my beer worse off for it? That was the question that motivated me to test it out for myself. So for this yeast nutrient experiment, I brewed a single 10-gallon batch of one of my favorite styles, Schwartz beer. The grist included 37% Mecca grade La Manta pale malt, 35% Pelton Pilsner malt. I think I actually ran out of the Pelton, and so I replaced it with La Manta. 18% Metolius, that's their Munich style malt, and then 7% of Gladfield light chocolate malt. That's a rad maltster out of New Zealand, and then 3% C15. I mashed those grains for 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius for 60 minutes. I then boiled after the mash. I'm going to give the hop additions for a 5-gallon batch because I think most people are brewing 5-gallon batches. So for a 60-minute boil, I did 11 grams of Horizon at 60 minutes and then 31 grams of Tettnang at 15 minutes. If you're doing 10 gallons, you just double that. After the boil, I chilled the worts and I took a refractometer reading showing that the wort had hit my target 1053 OG. Pretty money for a Schwartz beer in my opinion. I split the wort between 2 identical SS Brewtech brew buckets and then prepared the yeast nutrient. Now, there were some questions about the way that I went about this. I used the Yeast beer nutrient blend, like I said, and which includes a, quote, proprietary blend of vitamins, minerals, inorganic nitrogen, organic nitrogen, zinc, phosphates, and other trace elements. Per Yeast recommendations, I added half a teaspoon, which is about 2.2 grams of nutrient to a small amount of hot water after the wort had already been racked to the fermentation vessels. I allowed the yeast nutrient to totally dissolve for a few minutes before adding it to one batch. I left the other one completely alone. But to keep things as equal as possible, I did add the same amount of hot water to the non-nutrient batch. Again, we wanted to keep things as identical as possible. Somebody did point out that Yeast recommends to add the nutrient last 10 minutes of the boil. I don't know why I missed that, but I did learn later on down the line that they only recommend that to ensure that the nutrients fully dissolved, which I did in the hot water prior to adding it to the batch.
Right. That's what I was going to say. It's more about the making sure that the nutrient is actually dissolved. Otherwise, it won't actually add anything to the fermentation. But if you've done that, I mean, you can add the nutrient during fermentation. And a lot of people actually do that. A lot of professional brewers even add nutrient while fermentation is happening. So
yeah, well, and you listen to people who are adding nutrients to things like mead and cider and staggered nutrient additions and all of this. You can add it directly. I actually went to the Yeast website and looked it up, and sure enough, that's totally fine to do that. In fact, they recommend for like mead makers they're not doing any boils, just to add it directly into the wort or the must, and it works out fine. So the worts were left to finish chilling to my desired fermentation temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius. That took a couple of hours. They were just sitting in my fermentation chamber. And once they were to that temperature, I returned and I pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest into each batch. So I went direct on this one, which I've been doing a lot lately when using Imperial Yeast. But my thinking was, don't do anything else to potentially negate the impact of the yeast nutrient, such as making a starter. So I just went with a single pouch into each batch. One got the yeast nutrient, the other one didn't. Oddly enough, this surprised me based on my experience using nutrients with cider. I noticed similar airlock activity from both beers the following morning, and which was only, less than 12 hours later, indicating to me that there was minimal difference in lag. It's possible that all the nutrients needed were already available in that wort, or that, the yeast was just so healthy when I pitched it that perhaps the nutrient didn't have much of an impact. I don't know. But I left the beers alone at 55F, 13C for 2 weeks, at which point I took hydrometer measurements showing that both had finished at the same exact finishing gravity. It was 1012. So again, no differences in lag, no differences in attenuation. Of course, I'm wondering if there's going to be a noticeable difference in sensory side of things. But at this point, I swapped the airlocks on the fermentation vessels for CO2 filled balloons, which we call balloon locks. I cold crashed the beers. And then curious if the nutrients might have an impact on the clarity, I skipped my regular gelatin finding process. I had heard that, the more healthy your yeast is during fermentation, the prettier that beer can end up being. It does its thing, it gets out of the way. And so I didn't want to get in the way of that. Is that we didn't really talk much about the impact yeast can have on beer appearance, or yeast nutrient can have on beer appearance. Is that something you've heard as well?
I haven't really heard that the nutrients would affect beer appearance, other than maybe helping with the ways that yeast may affect it. So like maybe some beer foam quality, or a mouthfeel, body kind of issues, but not necessarily directly related to the addition of the yeast nutrient. More so the yeast doing its job, or whatever the outcome is that you want. If you wanted to improve foam, that kind of stuff.
It was just something that I didn't want, to introduce another variable that could potentially, again, negate the impact of the yeast nutrient. So I didn't find them with gelatin. I put the filled kegs in my keezer on gas, let them carbonate over 2 weeks before I began serving them to tasters. When I did start serving them, of course, I was drinking them the entire time up until those 2 weeks. But both of the beers ended up looking exactly the same color, same level of clarity. They were both pretty bright. No differences in the way they looked whatsoever. Both had the same foam stand. Everything seemed similar there. I ended up doing 7 triangle test attempts on this one, and really, again, we're completely biased. We know exactly what to look for, and we're going in there hoping to find or kind of intent on tasting or perceiving a difference. Out of those 7 attempts, I got 2 correct, which is worse than chance. These beers, to my palate, were absolutely identical. Nothing was distinct about either of them. Of course, that's not what counts. I ended up serving these beers to 21 participants, out of which 12 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say that there was a significant difference. But in the end, only 8 people did, just about random chance. 7 would have been 1/3. That's 38% of the participant pool. Again, indicating that this was just not a significant experiment, and allowing us to say, at least in this experiment with this panel of tasters, the yeast nutrient did not seem to have a perceptible impact on the beer, but also based on my own observations, it didn't seem to have really any impact in terms of fermentation or anything like that as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting experiment too. we spent the whole second segment talking about how and why nutrient is used, and talking about how, professional brewers are using it. And obviously there's a product out there. White Labs and Yeast are making a product that's for sale, and people are buying it to add nutrient to the beer. And then this result comes out and says, well, actually, it really didn't matter in this example, in this specific experiment. I always find that stuff interesting. And I love, it's one of the things I love about brewlosophy. Is putting these sorts of things to the test. And of course, we're not saying that this is conclusive evidence. It's just one experiment, but it's really fascinating. All of the things that you expect to see: an increased lag time, or a shorter lag time, and a faster fermentation. Maybe less extra production, maybe less sulfur. All of those reasons why we want to add nutrients to help the yeast out. And it turns out in this experiment, there was no difference, at least no perceptible difference.
Right. And I would caution anyone against taking this single data point, I'm going to say it again, as absolute fact and using it, to justify their opinion that yeast nutrients are not necessary. The fact is that the absolute truth is nutrients are necessary. Do we need to add exogenous nutrients every single time we brew beer? Maybe not. I mean, I've made hundreds and hundreds of batches without adding any yeast nutrient. I don't get stuck fermentations. But I also mind all of these other elements of my brewing process. I pay attention to water chemistry. I'm doing as much as I can to keep my yeast as healthy as possible. That may not involve nutrients. So to me, what this shows is, again, maybe you don't need to be adding yeast nutrient when making beer. I will always use it when I'm making cider because I have seen very real differences. And we've done an experiment on cider as well, which we'll get to in a further episode. But to me, after this experiment and being the one who brewed it and got to taste these beers, I view the use of yeast nutrients by those who want to do it as sort of like a prophylactic against possible problems, right? The same way we use so many other methods. It's just good insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good insurance. I'll also say that, things on the homebrew scale are different than the professional scale, right? So at the homebrew scale, maybe there's different pressures that you're dealing with or different stress conditions that the yeast are under, so they don't need necessarily as much nutrient, right? Like you said. So maybe what was on, maybe what was in the grain or in the wort, Mecha-Grade is a craft maltster, doing really good, really interesting things, really good quality malts. So maybe the quality of the ingredient also affected it. That's not to say that other maltsters that other maltsters are deficient. I'm just saying, that could have affected this specific experiment. So on the homebrew scale, with this result, it's really interesting to me that the nutrient wasn't necessarily a perceptible impact. I mean, again, we know that, like you said, yeast need nutrient in order to perform. We can test that objectively and show that. Multiple studies have seen that. In terms of, for me, I've used yeast nutrient a couple of times, mostly for lager brewing back whenever I was doing sort of traditional lagering methods, although maybe adding yeast nutrient may or may not be traditional, I guess. I was adding yeast nutrient, and I noticed a little bit what I would say subjectively or anecdotally is that I noticed fermentation maybe going a little bit faster or taking off a little bit faster in some of the lagers that I was brewing. But I don't have any objective data to go back and look at. That's just sort of what my perception was. So I was using nutrient a lot, and I don't necessarily use nutrient as much anymore just because like this experiment, I haven't really noticed a perceptible difference, right? When I don't add nutrient, in fact, when I'm pitching with the direct pitches of Imperial yeast, those things crank out really well. I didn't need, I've never had an issue with Imperial yeast's, productivity. Even letting some of those yeast packets sit in my fridge for a few months, they still seem to be doing really well. And really produce good beer. So I don't know if that says something also about the quality of Imperial's yeast, or just, any of these things. Any of these things could have impacted the result of this experiment. Again, I just find it really fascinating that the yeast nutrient didn't have a perceptible impact.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. If I'm a professional brewer and I'm making 7+ barrel batches, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to not have to dump that beer. And using yeast nutrient is an easy
go. As a home brewer, I still forget to use it, even though I have it sitting around because I never have. And seeing that I haven't had issues and it's only 5-gallon batches, it's not a big deal for me. I can totally understand why somebody might choose to do that. I like your comment about imperial yeast. And in fact, our first reader comment is about just that. Jeremiah Tyson says, I liked this one as I am always looking for ways to refine my process and habits. I use yeast nutrient on every batch, but I've never tried them side by side. My understanding is that imperial yeast is almost always among the freshest yeast you can buy. Amen. I feel like yeast nutrient is always good, but the effect may be more noticeable on a beer fermented with older yeast. It's common to find white labs and Y yeast aged 2 to 3 months on the date of purchase. Maybe try the same experiment with older yeast and see if there's a perceived difference. Nobody likes wasting batches, but that may yield the result you initially wondered about. I really like what Jeremiah is saying here is that yeast nutrient may be a good way to ensure better yeast performance, maybe when that yeast isn't in tip-top shape to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the yeast is sitting in a contained package whenever it's being shipped, right? So getting fresh yeast and pitching fresh yeast is always the most ideal. We talk about that a lot, or at least should be the most ideal. So yeah, if yeast is sitting out in a package for a while, it's going to be consuming those nutrients. One thing that I would say here as well is temperature is really going to affect that as well for Y yeast and white labs and those things. So if you're storing yeast at a cool temperature, it's going to use less of the nutrient because it doesn't need it as much. It's still hibernating. But my experience has always been with imperial yeast. I mean, I've left some of those yeast packets in the refrigerator for 5-6 months, not just 2 or 3 months, and I haven't seen any issues. So like I said, I don't know if that's an imperial process that they're doing it better. I haven't done it with white labs or Y yeast to see, if those yeasts last longer. I'm not really interested in doing it because I have, again, I'm really satisfied with what Imperial's been producing. But maybe in the future, and I mean, there's certainly something to be said for if you're using older yeast that's nutrient deficient, or like I was mentioning earlier, a multi-generational pitch. That may be where nutrient becomes more important.
All right, next comment comes from Dan. He says, this kind of goes along the same lines, at least in my thinking. He says, I think I would have removed the hot break and trub, which I think gets removed by the big guys for less yeast nutrient. I've seen that some breweries remove the hot break because they contain staling/oxidizing agents, but since it also contains yeast nutrients, they add back the nutrients. We kind of talked a little bit about this. What I think would be interesting is to do we've shown over and over, for example, that in our kettle trub experiments that a wort that is deficient in trub, that is very, very clear and clean when it gets racked to the fermentation vessel, that it has a longer lag. And I've even done in non-experiment batches where I was just testing stuff out before Brewlosophy was around, worse attenuation, it finished higher, all of this stuff. I'd be really interested to do a higher trub, maybe like a moderate level of trub versus one with no trub, but yeast nutrient, and see if that doesn't make up for that difference that we've observed.
Yeah. This is a really insightful comment from Dan. I mean, we talked about trub earlier. We didn't mention it, but that's also something that could have affected this experiment, right? The trub itself might have had a sufficient amount of nutrient.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. I'd like to do that too, to see about, the hot break or the trub versus a nutrient and see if it's useful. Especially with that. Maybe that's something we'll pitch to the group and see if we can get that one going.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. Next comment comes from Jay Pyro. He says, I bought yeast nutrient recently because I'm going to brew a Brut IPA. Now, real quick, if you haven't heard of Brut IPA, it kind of came and went very quickly in the brewing world. But he says that according to Kim Sturdivant of Social Kitchen and Brewery, who's known for inventing Brut IPA, quote, it's very important to add nutrient to the boil as well as halfway through fermentation, since the wort will be almost entirely glucose. There's not a lot of nutrition for the yeast. J. Pyro goes on to say, I've never used it before, but in this case, it makes sense. I'm curious if your results would have been different in a more stressful environment with either less yeast nutrients naturally in the wort or a higher alcohol brew. Now, the thing about brewed IPA is it's known for being incredibly dry. That's the idea behind it. So I think what Kim from Social Kitchen and Brewery is the reason he's recommending, adding the nutrient is because it encourages the attenuation, right? And so to add the nutrient both into the boil and then halfway through fermentation is just, again, doing your best to make sure that those yeast just don't putter out.
Well, yeah, the two things. I think also depending on what recipe you're using for brut IPA, you may be using some additional enzymes, or more often, I think what people are doing are adding adjunct sugar to dry it out. And also get that sort of higher carbonation level if you're naturally carbonating. So there may be an adjunct that's being added. So Kim's comment, I don't really know the source of it or what the other things were that she was talking about. But if there is a high proportion of table sugar or something, glucose, that doesn't have any of the other. We talked about that at the top. That doesn't have the other nutrients that yeast needs, and so it may create a more stressful environment. So that aspect of it also could be a reason why in brut IPA, yeast nutrient may be more necessary.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Next comment comes from our friend Eric Pierce. He says, I recently did back-to-back batches of equal OG beers. They were both around 1040. Very similar recipes using dry yeast sprinkled on the top, no starter. The first batch had no yeast nutrient added and took 12 hours to get going. The second batch started going at 6 hours. I think the imperial yeast may already have more yeast nutrients built in to the liquid packs than the emulsifiers that are present in dry yeast. Ooh, that's a good point. I never used yeast nutrient with imperial yeast. They kick off quickly and I rarely make a starter with them. Yeah. I was talking about my experience using yeast nutrient in hard ciders, but it didn't really cross my mind that I've only, to this point pitched dry yeast into those. And I do notice more lag when I'm using dry yeast in general, whether it's for beer, cider, or whatever. So perhaps it using nutrient with the way that they're producing or processing the dry yeast, it may demand the yeast nutrient may have a more positive impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder. He makes a really good comment that it has more yeast nutrients built into the liquid pack than the emulsifiers and the dry yeast. I think that's a really insightful comment. That's something that really could be true. It also just could be the access, the bioavailability of the nutrients in a liquid yeast pack. The liquid itself that the yeast is floating around in is nutrient rich for storage. So pitching that directly, the yeast that's in there already has access to the nutrients, whereas there may be some sort of lag. This is totally speculation. I have no idea if this is actually true, but maybe some sort of lag about getting the nutrients, getting the yeast access to the nutrients as everything's sort of rehydrating in the wort, I could see that may delay things a little bit, but again, no idea.
Yeah, likewise. It makes sense to me. So, yeah. All right. Next comment comes from Blair Street. Based on all the recent findings at the homebrew scale, yeast nutrient seems a lot like oxygenation to me. You can probably make the same beer without it most of the time. In my mind, it's cheap insurance in the event that your yeasts aren't in tip-top shape. With that in mind, I only end up using yeast nutrient when repitching yeast. I've forgotten before and haven't noticed much of a difference, but it's cheap insurance when I'm reusing the cake of a lower gravity beer and putting it through a second or third fermentation in a higher gravity beer. I think that is such a good recommendation that if you are reusing yeast that's already done a lot of work in one batch, probably not a bad idea to give it a little bit of help for the next batch that you plan to ferment with it.
Yeah, I mean, this is on the list of experiments that I want to pitch to the group here pretty soon. Is doing this again with not a direct pitch, but maybe it's a second generation or third generation of the yeast, and see if that makes a difference for nutrient. But yeah, that's again another really insightful comment. I love our readers. I mean, you guys are incredible. Even thinking about things that we're not normally. Or maybe may have missed, but this is another really insightful comment. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, our final one comes from Les Howarth. He says that if you want to use yeast nutrient and you want a free alternative, you can add some surplus yeast from a previous batch to the boil. This will obviously kill the yeast, but it will release its nutrients for subsequent consumption by your pitched yeast. This is a practice that's been used by some British brewers.
Interesting. So I don't know that I necessarily understand what you mean by adding surplus yeast from a previous brew. Is he?
My understanding, I've actually heard this before, is literally taking, a teaspoon of yeast from the cake of a previous batch and tossing it in the last 10 minutes of the boil for a next batch, killing the yeast. But then in that process, that yeast is giving up the nutrients, sort of the way that, Cerevomyces works, apparently, is how people talk about it. So.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Okay. I guess I was misunderstanding when we were adding the surplus yeast. Yeah, that to me sounds almost exactly like would be doing with either Y yeast nutrient blend or Cerevomyces. You're adding a bunch of nutrient dense yeast cells in there, killing them off, and then releasing all the nutrients and cell materials, and then making it available.
Not only that, you're actually, considering what all makes up trube, the trube of a finished batch of beer, you're also adding all that other gunky stuff that could potentially have beneficial nutrient effects, I suppose. So I think it's a good comment, good idea. If you want to try it out, give it a shot. I doubt it's going to negatively impact the beer. It's not that much yeast that you're adding. Well, Cade, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Do you have anything else on yeast nutrients before we hit the road?
Oh, I could talk more about yeast nutrient if we need to, but hopefully I didn't bore any of the listeners today with the science aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, if you're noticing issues with your fermentation, try some yeast nutrient. And if you have any questions, just shoot me an email and I'll answer anything that I can.
Yeah, I'm with you. If you are a nut like us and you just want to make sure that your beer is, or the wort that you're pitching yeast into, is in the best absolute shape possible, pick up a little yeast nutrient and add it to it. I'm not going to be doing that, mostly because I'm so forgetful, but I will always be adding yeast nutrient when I'm making my hard cider. So, all right, don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the experiment we talked about in this episode, as well as all of the other fun stuff we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.